The room had never felt so cold, even though the lights were still burning brightly above them. Jimin stood trembling, tears streaming down his face, while Jungkook struggled to hold back his own. Between them lay years of trust, memories, and sacrifices that suddenly seemed to mean nothing. Taehyung rushed forward, desperately trying to stop the two from tearing apart, but the pain had already gone too deep. What none of them knew was that the argument had been triggered by a secret sacrifice one of them had hidden for months. And when the truth finally surfaced, it would leave everyone wondering who had actually betrayed whom. Long before tears filled the room and their friendship seemed to stand on the edge of collapse, Jimin and Jungkook had shared a bond that had survived countless exhausting days, sleepless nights, overwhelming schedules, and moments when the entire world seemed to demand more from them than they had left to give. Their connection had never depended on grand promises. It lived in the smallest things, the quiet understanding between them after a difficult performance, the instinctive way they noticed when the other was exhausted, and the comfort of simply being near each other when words felt unnecessary. To everyone around them, Jimin and Jungkook seemed almost impossible to separate. Their friendship carried a strange familiarity, as though years of shared experiences had created a language only they could understand. Jimin had always been sensitive to changes in the people he cared about. He could recognize exhaustion behind a smile, disappointment hidden beneath a casual gesture, and loneliness disguised as confidence. Jungkook, meanwhile, had developed a habit of carrying his problems alone. His athletic determination often made him appear stronger than he actually felt, and whenever something hurt him, his first instinct was to bury it beneath work, training, and responsibility. Somehow, Jimin had always been able to see through that armor. He knew when Jungkook was pretending to be fine. He knew when silence meant something more than silence. That was why the subtle distance between them had begun to frighten him. At first, the changes were almost invisible. Jungkook started leaving rooms earlier than usual. He became quieter during moments when they would normally laugh together. Messages that once received immediate attention sometimes remained unanswered for hours. There were no obvious arguments, no dramatic betrayal, and no single event that could explain the growing distance. Yet Jimin felt something slipping away. The more he tried to understand it, the more uncertain he became. Jungkook was struggling with something, but every attempt to approach the subject seemed to make him retreat further. His exhaustion had become increasingly difficult to hide. There were nights when he remained awake long after everyone else had gone to sleep, sitting alone beneath dim lights with an expression that seemed burdened by thoughts he refused to share. Sometimes Taehyung noticed him first. Sometimes RM quietly watched from a distance. Even Jin, Suga, and J-Hope began sensing that something was different. But none of them understood how serious it was. Jimin's concern slowly transformed into insecurity. He began wondering whether he had done something wrong. Every unexplained absence felt personal. Every quiet reaction seemed like rejection. Every moment Jungkook chose distance over closeness created another question that Jimin could not answer. Meanwhile, Jungkook was fighting a completely different battle. He believed that keeping Jimin away from his problems was an act of protection. He had convinced himself that if Jimin knew the truth, the emotional burden would become unbearable for both of them. So he began making difficult decisions in silence, accepting sacrifices that nobody had asked him to make, and hiding the consequences behind an increasingly fragile appearance of normality. The tragedy was that Jimin interpreted that silence in the exact opposite way. What Jungkook believed was protection looked like abandonment to Jimin. What Jimin believed was rejection was actually Jungkook's desperate attempt to protect the person he cared about most. And with every passing day, the misunderstanding grew stronger. One evening, the group gathered after a particularly exhausting schedule. The atmosphere should have felt familiar, but an uncomfortable tension followed them into the room. RM noticed the silence first. Jin attempted to lighten the mood through his usual warmth, while J-Hope quietly observed the two men who barely looked at each other. Suga remained unusually still, sensing that forcing the situation would only make things worse. Taehyung, however, could not ignore what was happening. His attention moved repeatedly between Jimin and Jungkook. Jimin looked hurt. Jungkook looked guilty. Neither seemed willing to reveal why. Then came the moment that changed everything. Jimin noticed something that Jungkook had tried desperately to hide. It was small, almost insignificant, but it carried a meaning Jimin could not ignore. For the first time, he realized that Jungkook had been making decisions without telling him. Decisions involving their future, their friendship, and sacrifices that appeared to have been made entirely alone. Instead of giving Jimin answers, Jungkook withdrew. That single reaction wounded Jimin more deeply than any accusation could have. He began believing that the person he trusted most no longer trusted him enough to share the truth. And somewhere inside Jungkook's silence was a secret that could either repair everything between them or destroy it completely. Neither of them realized that the next few hours would bring that secret dangerously close to the surface. The secret did not reveal itself all at once. It appeared in fragments, scattered across small moments that seemed meaningless individually but became impossible to ignore when placed together. Jimin began noticing that Jungkook was constantly checking his phone and quickly hiding the screen whenever someone came near. There were unfamiliar appointments on his schedule, sudden changes in plans, and moments when he disappeared without explanation. None of it would have mattered if Jungkook had behaved normally, but his silence made every unexplained detail feel like evidence of something Jimin was not supposed to know. Jimin tried to convince himself that he was overthinking everything. He reminded himself of how many times Jungkook had stood beside him when life became overwhelming. He remembered the nights when exhaustion had nearly broken them, yet Jungkook had remained nearby. He remembered the quiet gestures, the loyalty, the countless moments when neither needed to explain what the other was feeling. Those memories should have reassured him. Instead, they made the distance hurt even more. Because the closer two people had once been, the more painful silence became. Jungkook noticed Jimin's changing behavior, but interpreted it differently. He saw the hesitation in Jimin's eyes and assumed that Jimin was becoming tired of dealing with him. His own guilt made every expression appear harsher than it really was. He believed that if Jimin discovered what he had done, their relationship might never recover. So that decision became the first real crack in the foundation of their trust. Taehyung was the first to recognize the pattern. He noticed how Jimin would enter a room and instinctively search for Jungkook, only to stop himself when their eyes met. He noticed how Jungkook would quietly leave whenever Jimin approached. Their movements seemed almost synchronized, but instead of bringing them closer, they were moving around each other like two people afraid of colliding. Taehyung tried to understand what had happened. There was no obvious betrayal, no public incident, no single mistake that explained the tension. Yet the emotional distance was becoming impossible to hide. Then Jimin discovered another piece of the puzzle. An envelope had been left among some personal belongings, carrying information that immediately made his heart sink. It revealed that Jungkook had been involved in a decision that directly affected something Jimin had been preparing for. The details were incomplete, but they were enough to create a terrifying possibility. Jungkook had changed something without telling him. Jimin could not understand why. For hours, he remained trapped between anger and fear. Anger told him that Jungkook had crossed a line. Fear whispered that there was something much worse behind the decision. When Jungkook finally returned, Jimin's expression had already changed. Jungkook immediately sensed it. The atmosphere between them became heavy before either had time to process what was happening. Jimin's disappointment was visible, but Jungkook saw only accusation. His guilt immediately transformed into defensiveness. Instead of explaining himself, he withdrew further, convinced that silence was still safer than exposing the truth. That was when the misunderstanding became dangerous. Jimin began believing that Jungkook had deliberately kept him in the dark because he no longer trusted him. Jungkook began believing that Jimin was angry because he had failed him. Neither realized that they were reacting to fears rather than facts. The following days became increasingly painful. They remained surrounded by people who cared about them, yet somehow both felt completely alone. RM noticed the change and tried to create moments where they could be together without pressure. Jin quietly looked for ways to ease the tension. Suga watched from a distance, understanding that some wounds could not be forced open. J-Hope continued offering warmth, hoping that familiarity might eventually break through the coldness. But Jimin and Jungkook were already trapped inside their own interpretations. One evening, Jimin saw Jungkook receiving a message that seemed to confirm everything he feared. Jungkook read it with a devastated expression before immediately putting his phone away. To Jimin, the reaction looked like guilt. In reality, it was fear. The message contained information about the sacrifice Jungkook had been making in secret. He had been quietly giving up opportunities, changing plans, and taking responsibility for consequences that were never supposed to belong to him. He believed that doing so would protect Jimin from a situation that could have damaged everything they had built. But Jimin did not know any of that. All he could see was a person he loved becoming increasingly distant. The next misunderstanding came when Jimin overheard part of a conversation involving Jungkook and another person. Without knowing the full context, he interpreted the words as proof that Jungkook had made a decision about their relationship without considering his feelings. The discovery shattered something inside him. For the first time, Jimin stopped trying to understand. He began preparing himself to let go. Jungkook noticed the change almost immediately. Jimin stopped waiting for him. He stopped searching for him in crowded rooms. He stopped offering the small gestures that had once made their connection feel effortless. That silence frightened Jungkook more than any argument could have. He had sacrificed so much because he wanted to protect Jimin, yet the very act of protecting him was pushing Jimin farther away. Still, Jungkook could not bring himself to reveal the truth. He was terrified that if Jimin knew everything, the sacrifice would become meaningless. Then an unexpected discovery changed the situation. Taehyung found evidence that contradicted what everyone had assumed. It showed that Jungkook had not been hiding something because he wanted to betray Jimin. He had been hiding something because he believed someone else was already suffering because of him. Taehyung finally understood that the story was much larger than the conflict between two friends. There was a sacrifice at its center, and someone had been carrying the consequences alone. But before that revelation left Taehyung deeply unsettled. Because if Jimin learned the truth from the wrong person, he might believe that Jungkook had sacrificed everything because of him, and that could create an even deeper wound. Meanwhile, Jimin reached a breaking point. The emotional pressure had accumulated for too long. Every unanswered question had become heavier. Every moment of silence had strengthened the belief that he was no longer important to Jungkook. He had spent days trying to protect their friendship from his own fears, but those fears were now stronger than his ability to remain silent. Jungkook was equally exhausted. His guilt had become unbearable. He wanted to explain everything, but every possible explanation seemed capable of hurting Jimin even more. He believed that revealing the truth would force Jimin to carry a burden that should have remained his alone. Then the two finally found themselves in the same room with nowhere left to escape. Taehyung was there. So were RM, Jin, Suga, and J-Hope. Everyone immediately sensed that something was about to happen. Jimin's eyes were already filled with tears. Jungkook looked as though he had not slept in days. The room became silent. What began as a misunderstanding slowly transformed into years of unspoken emotions rising toward the surface. Jimin's pain finally broke through his restraint. The frustration he had carried for days became impossible to contain. His disappointment, fear, loneliness, and confusion collided at once. Jungkook reacted from his own wounded state, and the more emotional the moment became, the harder it was for either of them to recognize what the other was actually trying to say. Taehyung moved between them, desperately attempting to prevent the argument from becoming irreversible. But the damage had already begun. Jimin's tears fell faster. Jungkook's composure collapsed, and for the first time, Both of them looked less like two people arguing and more like two people terrified of losing each other. The others watched helplessly. RM understood that this was no longer an ordinary disagreement. Jin's expression revealed the pain of seeing two people who cared deeply for each other become trapped by misunderstanding. Suga realized that the truth had to come out before the emotional damage became permanent. J-Hope remained close, silently hoping that the friendship could survive what was coming. Taehyung continued trying to stop the confrontation from escalating. But then Jimin noticed something that made him freeze. A document had fallen from Jungkook's belongings. For a moment, nobody moved. Jimin looked at it, then at Jungkook, and finally back at the document. The information inside revealed that Jungkook had been carrying a responsibility that Jimin had never known existed. The sacrifice was real. The consequences were real. But the most painful part was realizing that Jungkook had never intended to tell him. Jimin's anger turned into heartbreak. He finally understood that Jungkook had been suffering in silence. But instead of feeling relieved, Jimin felt devastated. Because all those days when he thought Jungkook was abandoning him had actually been days when Jungkook was struggling alone. Yet one question remained. Why had Jungkook believed that Jimin could never handle the truth? That question struck deeper than the original misunderstanding. Jungkook's silence now looked different. It was no longer simply secrecy. It was fear. Fear of losing Jimin. Fear of becoming a burden. Fear that revealing the truth would destroy the very person he was trying to protect. But Jimin could not immediately forgive him. The revelation did not erase the pain. It explained it. And sometimes understanding why someone hurt you does not immediately stop the wound from hurting. The room remained frozen as Jimin struggled between anger and compassion. Jungkook looked completely broken. Taehyung finally realized that the confrontation had reached the point where stopping it was no longer enough. The truth had to be fully exposed, because there was still one final secret that nobody knew. And when that secret came out, even Jungkook's sacrifice would look different. The document was only the beginning. The real reason behind everything was still hidden, and it was about to change the way Jimin understood their entire relationship. The room seemed to lose its air as Jimin stared at the document in his hands. The words were visible, yet his mind struggled to process what they meant. For weeks, he had believed that Jungkook was pulling away because their bond had changed. He had wondered whether he had become a burden, whether something he had done had destroyed the trust between them, or whether Jungkook had simply decided that their closeness no longer mattered. Now, piece by piece, those assumptions were collapsing. Jungkook had been sacrificing himself in silence. But the discovery did not immediately bring relief. Instead, it created another wound. Jimin realized that Jungkook had made one of the most important decisions of his life without allowing him to participate. He had carried the fear, the responsibility, and the consequences alone, convinced that protecting Jimin meant keeping him outside the truth. Jimin's tears continued falling as the anger inside him became impossible to separate from love. He could finally understand Jungkook's intention, but he could not understand why Jungkook had believed that he had to suffer alone. Taehyung remained between them, watching the two friends reach the point they had spent weeks desperately avoiding. Jungkook's composure finally disappeared. The strength he had used to conceal his exhaustion collapsed beneath the weight of everything he had been carrying. His posture changed, his breathing became uneven, and the carefully controlled expression he had maintained for so long gave way to visible regret. For the first time, everyone could see how much the secret had cost him. The nights without sleep, the opportunities he had abandoned, the decisions he had made alone, the guilt he had carried every time Jimin looked at him with confusion. Everything suddenly had a price, and Jungkook had been paying it quietly. But then Taehyung revealed what he had discovered earlier. The sacrifice had never been only about protecting Jimin from an external problem. Jungkook had learned that a difficult situation could potentially affect Jimin's future. A decision had been placed in front of him, and Jungkook had chosen to take responsibility because he believed Jimin should not have to sacrifice something important for his sake. The problem was that Jungkook had misunderstood what protection truly meant. He had assumed that love required carrying every burden alone. He had mistaken silence for strength, and by doing so, he had taken away Jimin's right to stand beside him. That realization destroyed Jimin emotionally, because all he had wanted was to be there. He had never needed Jungkook to be perfect. He had never needed him to solve everything. He had only needed him to trust that they could face difficult things together. Jungkook finally understood the depth of that mistake. The sacrifice he believed would prove his loyalty had instead created the exact distance he had been trying to prevent. Jimin's anger returned, but it was no longer the anger of someone who felt betrayed. It was the anger of someone who had been denied the chance to help. His tears became a reflection of everything he had endured while believing he was being abandoned. Jungkook could not escape the truth anymore. He had not protected Jimin. He had protected himself from the possibility of seeing Jimin suffer because of him. The distinction was painful, and it changed everything. Taehyung watched as the confrontation reached its emotional peak. Jimin's body trembled from exhaustion and grief. Jungkook stood only a few steps away, visibly fighting against the urge to retreat again. But this time he stayed. He did not hide. He did not look away. He allowed Jimin to see every emotion he had spent weeks concealing. That was the moment when the final secret emerged. Jungkook had not only sacrificed an opportunity, he had also accepted blame for a misunderstanding that was never entirely his fault. Someone else had made an assumption about Jimin's situation, and Jungkook had quietly accepted responsibility because he feared that exposing the truth would create conflict around Jimin. He had chosen to become the person everyone could blame if it meant keeping Jimin away from the consequences. That decision had isolated him, and eventually, it had made Jimin believe that Jungkook himself was the source of the pain. The irony was devastating. Jungkook had allowed himself to be misunderstood because he believed misunderstanding was less painful than watching Jimin suffer. But Jimin had suffered anyway, perhaps even more deeply. The room fell silent. There was no villain, no simple betrayal, no cruel intention. There were only two people who cared so deeply about each other that they had made opposite mistakes. Jungkook had tried to protect Jimin through silence. Jimin had tried to protect their relationship by searching for the truth. Both had acted from loyalty. Both had ended up hurting each other. Jimin finally realized that the person he had accused of abandoning him had actually been standing in the darkness, waiting for him to be safe. And Jungkook realized that the person he had tried to protect had never wanted protection at the cost of trust. The emotional weight became too much. Jungkook finally broke down. The tears he had held back for weeks came without restraint. His face revealed exhaustion, guilt, fear, and relief all at once. He looked less like someone defending a decision and more like someone finally allowing himself to admit that he had been afraid. Jimin's anger slowly dissolved into grief. He had spent so long believing that Jungkook no longer needed him. Now he understood that Jungkook had needed him more than ever. The realization was almost unbearable. Taehyung stepped back. For the first time that night, he understood that there was nothing left for him to stop. The confrontation had transformed into something deeper. It had become a reckoning. Jimin and Jungkook were no longer fighting over the document. They were confronting every moment when they had failed to trust each other. Every unanswered question, every hidden fear, every time one of them had chosen silence instead of vulnerability. Every time love had been expressed through sacrifice rather than honesty. The emotional walls between them were finally collapsing. Yet reconciliation did not come immediately. Jimin was still hurt. Understanding did not erase the loneliness he had experienced. Jungkook was still ashamed. Knowing that his intentions had been good did not make his choices correct. They both had to face the consequences. And that was perhaps the hardest truth of all. Sometimes the most painful conflicts are not created by hatred. They're created by people who love each other but are too afraid to be honest. Jimin slowly approached Jungkook. The distance between them was only a few steps, but emotionally it represented weeks of fear. Jungkook remained still. For once, he did not try to control what happened next. He simply accepted whatever Jimin decided. That surrender carried more meaning than any explanation. Jimin finally reached him. The moment was quiet. There was no dramatic victory, no instant disappearance of pain. Only two exhausted people standing in front of each other after realizing how close they had come to losing something precious. Jimin's tears continued. Jungkook's tears continued. And Taehyung, watching from nearby, finally lowered his eyes. The conflict had not ended because one person had won. It ended because both finally understood that neither of them had ever wanted to win. They had only wanted to avoid losing each other. The discovery changed the atmosphere completely. The anger that had filled the room was replaced by something much heavier. Regret. Everyone understood that the relationship would never return to exactly what it had been before. Not because it was broken beyond repair, but because it had been forced to grow. Loyalty could no longer mean suffering alone, and sacrifice could no longer be used as a substitute for communication. Jimin finally understood that loving someone did not mean preventing them from experiencing pain. Sometimes love meant allowing them to stand beside you while the pain happened. Jungkook finally understood that being strong did not mean carrying everything alone. Sometimes strength meant admitting that you were afraid and allowing someone you trusted to help. The confrontation had started with anger. It ended with a painful kind of honesty. But there was still one final consequence. The sacrifice Jungkook had made could not simply be undone. The opportunity he had given up was already gone. The decision had already changed his future. And now Jimin had to live with the knowledge that Jungkook had changed his life because of him. That realization created a new question. The answer would not come that night. But as the room slowly became quieter, Jimin understood one thing. He could not change what Jungkook had sacrificed. He could not erase the weeks of misunderstanding. He could not take away the pain they had caused each other. But he could refuse to let that pain become meaningless. And perhaps that was where healing would finally begin. The morning after the confrontation arrived quietly, almost cruelly peacefully. Sunlight entered through the windows as if nothing had happened. Yet the room where everything had fallen apart still seemed to carry the weight of the previous night. Jimin had barely slept. Jungkook had slept even less. Neither of them could simply wake up and pretend that the tears, accusations, secrets, and painful revelations had disappeared with the darkness. The truth had finally been exposed, but truth alone could not repair a wounded relationship. Jimin spent the early hours thinking about every moment he had misunderstood. He remembered Jungkook becoming distant, the unanswered messages, the hidden appointments, the unexplained decisions, and the expression Jungkook had worn whenever Jimin approached him. For weeks, those memories had convinced him that he was being pushed away. Now, every memory carried a completely different meaning. The distance had been fear. The silence had been guilt. The secrecy had been an attempt to protect him. And yet Jimin knew he could not simply forgive everything because Jungkook's intentions had been good. That realization was important. Forgiveness was not the same as pretending nothing had happened. Jimin needed to acknowledge the hurt before he could release it. Across the room, Jungkook sat quietly, staring at his hands. The person who had spent weeks trying to appear strong now looked emotionally exhausted. The sacrifice had taken more from him than anyone realized, but the emotional damage caused by hiding it had become just as painful. Jungkook finally understood something he had never fully understood before. He had believed that carrying pain alone was an act of love. But love was never supposed to become isolation. The people around them understood that too. RM remained calm and thoughtful, recognizing that both Jimin and Jungkook needed time rather than pressure. Jin quietly tried to restore a sense of normality, creating small moments where everyone could breathe again. Suga offered no unnecessary intervention, but but his presence reminded them that sometimes support did not require explanations. J-Hope continued, bringing warmth into the room, slowly helping the atmosphere become less heavy. And Taehyung stayed closest to the emotional center of what had happened. He had witnessed everything. He had seen Jimin's anger. He had seen Jungkook's fear. He had watched the argument transform into tears. And he understood that his role had never been to choose a side. He had simply wanted both of them to stop fighting long enough to see what they were doing to each other. The following days were difficult. Jimin and Jungkook did not suddenly become inseparable again. Instead, they began rebuilding their connection through small actions. Jimin stopped assuming that silence meant rejection. Jungkook stopped assuming that protection required secrecy. When something troubled him, he began allowing himself to be honest. When Jimin felt afraid, he began expressing it instead of allowing the fear to become an accusation. It was uncomfortable at first. After so much misunderstanding, even simple honesty felt unfamiliar. But slowly something changed. The distance between them began disappearing. Not because the past had been forgotten, because they had finally learned how to talk about it without allowing it to control them. One evening, Jimin found himself looking at Jungkook from across the room. There was no dramatic moment. No tears. No confrontation. Just a quiet realization that the person standing there was still the same person who had once stayed beside him through countless difficult days. The difference was that now Jimin understood his silence, and Jungkook understood Jimin's need for reassurance. Their friendship had survived the conflict, but it had not survived unchanged. It had become more honest, more vulnerable, more mature. The sacrifice Jungkook had made remained a painful part of their story. He could not take it back. But Jimin slowly stopped viewing it as something he had to repay. That was another lesson they both needed to learn. Love was not a debt. Friendship was not a balance sheet. One person sacrificing something did not mean the other had to spend the rest of their life carrying guilt. Jimin eventually realized that the best way to honor Jungkook's sacrifice was not by feeling guilty forever. It was by making sure neither of them ever repeated the same mistake. Jungkook came to the same understanding from the opposite direction. He did not need to prove his loyalty by destroying his own peace. He did not need to protect Jimin from every difficulty. He only needed to trust that Jimin could face difficult things beside him. That became the foundation of their healing. Weeks passed. The tension slowly disappeared from their daily routines. There were moments when old memories resurfaced and made one of them hesitate. Sometimes Jimin still became afraid when Jungkook grew quiet. Sometimes Jungkook still instinctively tried to hide his worries. But now they recognized those patterns. And whenever the old fear appeared, they chose honesty instead of silence. That choice became more powerful than the original conflict, because healing was not a single moment. It was a collection of small decisions repeated every day. One afternoon, the group gathered again after another exhausting schedule. The atmosphere felt strangely familiar. Jin's energy filled the room. J-Hope's laughter broke through the tiredness. Suga remained quietly observant. RM focused on everyone around him. Taehyung watched Jimin and Jungkook with a subtle sense of relief. They were not pretending that nothing had happened. They were simply no longer allowing what happened to define them. Jimin and Jungkook eventually found themselves sitting near each other again. There was no need for dramatic reconciliation. The strongest evidence of healing was how natural their silence had become. This time, silence did not mean fear. It meant comfort. Taehyung remembered the night when he had stood between them, terrified that their relationship might collapse permanently. Now he saw something completely different. They were still imperfect, still capable of misunderstanding each other, still carrying scars from what had happened. But they had learned to recognize the warning signs before those scars could become new wounds. And perhaps that was the real victory. Not that they had avoided pain, but that pain had taught them how to care for each other better. Jungkook's sacrifice also changed the way the others viewed him. They had always known him as someone determined and dependable. But now they understood that even the strongest person could become overwhelmed when they believed they had to carry everything alone. Jimin learned the same lesson about himself. His sensitivity had sometimes made him question things too deeply. He had interpreted distance as rejection because he was afraid of losing someone important. Now he understood that fear could distort reality. A person could love you and still become distant. A person could be silent and still care. A person could make a mistake without becoming your enemy. That understanding gave Jimin a new kind of emotional strength. He no longer needed immediate answers to every uncertainty. He could wait. He could ask. He could listen. And most importantly, he could trust. Months later, the painful night had become a memory they rarely discussed. Not because it no longer mattered, but because they had finally made peace with it.